There we go.
So thank you, everybody who is joining us live today for a discussion of a report titled Post-Consumer Management of End-of-Life Electric Vehicle Batteries. It's a comparative study of regulatory regimes in Canada, the US, and the European Union. This report and webinar is hosted by York University's Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change from the Sustainable Energy Initiative. And today we have authors of the report, Mark Winfield, Jonathan Myers, and Sumit Such here to talk with us today. I'll give a brief introduction before we start off the presentation. My name is Laura Tangay, and I am a PhD candidate at York University in that Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. And for those of you tuning in after the live event, today is February 14th, and this webinar is being hosted from Toronto, Ontario, or Takaronto, located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. I'm going to put some links in the chat for those willing to engage in additional learning. And given the content that we will be discussing today and the historical, contemporary, and future ways that various life cycle stages of extraction disproportionately burden Indigenous communities, I encourage you to critically engage with this content and consider how Indigenous governance, laws, and cultures are impacted by and can influence these systems in the future. So before we get started here, I'd just like to introduce my colleague, Mark Winfield, who is a professor of environmental and urban change at York University and also the co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative. He is also the coordinator of the Joint Master of Environmental Studies and Juris Doctor program offered in conjunction with Osgoode Hall Law School and has published articles, book chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics. We also have Jonathan Myers, who completed the MES and JD program at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change and Osgoode Hall Law School in 2023. His graduate level research examined the circular economy and sustainability and how those concepts interact with energy transitions in response to climate change. Jonathan is currently completing his articling placement and hopes to practice litigation related to environmental and natural resource law. Sumit Such is a graduate of the Master of Environmental Studies program at York University and is a third-year student in the JD program at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto. His graduate level research concerned environmental policy and sustainability with a focus on energy storage and electric vehicle battery recycling. In law school, Sumit has focused on expanding his knowledge in the practice areas of corporate, securities, and tax law. So we're going to have a presentation today followed by an enriching discussion. For the discussion, you're very welcome to post your questions in the chat function, or also feel very free to raise your hand and we can get to you whatever way you're most comfortable. So I guess I'll kick it off over to you there, Mark.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you for the introduction. I'm going to do a screen share for a little presentation we're going to do. Let's see if this is going to work. It is. So this presentation flows from a, oops, hang on. These transitions are never smooth. Here we go. This presentation flows from a study that we completed last fall, looking at the post-consumer management of end-of-life electric vehicle batteries. And this flowed from both Jonathan and Sumit's major research projects for the purpose of the Master's of Environmental Studies and Master of Environmental Studies Juris Doctor programs. Also want to acknowledge a couple of other contributors, Abdi Salawari, who was a BES student who did some of the research, and then also Angela Dittrich, who's another MES JD student who helped us with the production and the layout as well. So this has been an SEI MES JD production. And it's led us into some very, very interesting places. Oops, yeah, there we go. The study, in some ways, emerged almost I would quite say by accident, but in some ways we stumbled into these questions, that it really flowed from two major research projects that we were undertaking through SEI. One was our participation in the Network on Energy Storage Technologies, or NEST-NET, which was funded by NSERC, and then also the Joint Climate Change and Transportation Research and Policy Partnership, which was a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Partnership Development Grant led by Mark Purdon at UQAM in Quebec. And initially, we were actually looking more at questions around advanced energy storage, including things like advanced batteries, in the context of grid integration and questions that we would now term the development of distributed energy resources. So this tying together building level resources with rooftop solar and storage and wire them together to microgrids. And somewhere along the line, part of what we were exploring here was this was coming up in particular in relation to electric vehicle batteries and the notion of there being a second life to these batteries once that they were done in vehicle applications. And that's typically where they're sort of down around 80% of original capacity. And the idea is, well, they're still perfectly good for grid applications. And indeed, our postdoctoral student who was part of the NEST project as well, Shahab Chakradaze, had actually done his work on grid uses of end-of-life electric vehicle batteries. So that was sort of where we were coming from. But then that kind of led into a whole series of further questions. I think at some point, somebody asked the question, well, what happens to these batteries when they're completely dead, as opposed to just mostly dead, or actually still mostly alive at that stage? And that led into a series of questions, both, as we'll discuss in the context of this study, both what happened at end of life, but also that, of course, is connected to a larger set of life cycle questions around advanced batteries, especially particularly supply chains, what are broadly referred to as particularly critical minerals and the extractive activities which go with those stages of production. And of course, part of the story here is we're hearing expectations about the need for major expansions in the extraction of primary materials, nickel, cobalt, lithium, other materials that go into advanced batteries, and also some growing concern, more than a little growing concern, but what the implications of that growth and extractive activity are from a sustainability perspective. As we sort of looked at this more structurally, we sort of looking at the literature, we broke this down into sort of 5 phases in terms of EV battery life cycles. And starting with the raw materials extraction and processing, this is the critical minerals component, the inputs into making the batteries, the processes of battery production, transportation from where the battery may be manufactured to the OEM or the original equipment manufacturer. These are the Volkswagens and Stellantises and Hondas and Teslas who are assembling the vehicle. We then go through a use phase where they do what they're supposed to do as an EV, which is to provide the energy to move the vehicle. And then finally, we reach the end of life stage. And as we looked at this, it became very clear that the sort of crucial questions around sustainability really arose at the front end of the process, the raw materials extraction and processing, basically the mining process for these materials, which are associated with very, very extensive environmental and social impacts, particularly, as Laura pointed out, for Indigenous communities in the locations where these activities happen. In the use phase, these EV batteries are regarded as relatively as quite safe. The big issue there is really around where does the electricity come from to provide the power for charging the batteries. That was something that was scoped out of this particular study, but is being addressed in other work that SEI is doing and other people are doing as well in terms of, well, what happens in terms of grid demand and infrastructures and where does that electricity come from. And then the final phase, again, which associated again with potentially very significant impacts, is at the end of life. And because you are dealing with materials, objects that are products that do contain a range of substances which have been classified as toxic for the purpose of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or under the U.S. Toxic Substances Control Act, or California Proposition 65 for that matter. The electrolytes are typically hydrocarbons, and so are chemically complex as well. So there are concerns about what happens in terms of disposal and the risks of releases of toxic substances, and also hazards to anybody who may be involved in the processes of trying to recycle or recover these batteries. And indeed, there are stories of this happening in a fairly artisanal kind of way. I see here the predictions are anticipate very large growth in numbers of electric vehicles in the market and in use. And we're very conscious that this also represents something of a downstream tidal wave, that there are going to be tens of millions of end-of-life batteries. Where we hit that point is a matter of some debate, but they clearly are going to get there. We have been finding the original thinking was typical EV battery life was probably going to be 8 to 10 years. We're finding in some cases it's doing better than that. So the curve may extend in terms of useful life, but at some point we are going to hit end of life, and we're going to be faced with questions of what do we do at that stage. The current options that we identify are a number of different possibilities, and one of the things we emphasize in the report, especially in a Canadian context, is the almost complete lack of any information in terms of what's actually happening. We ran into assertions from a number of people who are engaged with or in the community around the industry. The theory is that the materials in the batteries are sufficiently valuable that there are incentives for them to be recovered in some way and reprocessed or recycled, but we have absolutely zero information in the public realm in terms of what is actually happening, in terms of numbers of units which are reaching end of life and what's actually happening to them. There are a number of possibilities in this space. As I mentioned earlier, where we started out was this question of second life uses, that even though a battery may not be useful anymore in terms of its performance for vehicle purposes, it may be quite useful for grid purposes or household or facility energy storage level activities. Again, we had, and given that these are complex manufactured products into which there have been major investments of energy, materials, capital, and labor, it makes sense to extend their life as much as possible. And so if there are useful second life applications, they probably should be pursued. Again, we have no information really on the extent to which this may be happening or not in a North American context. They may just be ending up in storage. They may be going to some form of disposal. And again, literature is very clear. These are not things you want to put into a landfill or try and incinerate. You would almost certainly lead to the release of very substantial quantities of toxic substances. There are recycling and recovering possibilities, and there are three principal ones that arise here. One is hydrometallurgical processes, which is basically chemically processing the waste battery, typically after it's been shredded, which is basically what we're showing here in the picture, with the intention of being able to leach out particularly heavy metals and materials, like principally metals, that then might be recovered. These are processes which are themselves potentially quite problematic. You would be left with substantial liquid waste, for example, which were probably classified as hazardous. There's the possibility of pyrometallurgical processes, which is basically putting them into a smelter. And again, extracting, principally, it would be the heavy metals. In particular, you would probably be able to get out of that process. This is a very energy intensive process, associated with the generation of substantial emissions of toxic air pollution as well, and wastes. And then finally, and the literature on this tends to favor this option, of course, you can dismantle them, disassemble them, try and recover components for reuse or recovery, or even potentially you combine this, that you may want to dismantle the battery as much as possible with the intention of then only putting the parts with high concentrations of the materials you want to recover into hydrometallurgical or pyrometallurgical processes, because of course that would improve their efficiency. We had some interesting conversations with folks who run smelters and things like that around this. At the moment, this is not what's happening. What is happening is, to the extent to which EV batteries are being recycled, as far as we can tell in Canada, it is what's pictured here, which is basically to shred them into what's termed a black mass. And then that is passed on to a further processor to try and extract whatever useful materials there may be through hydrometallurgical or pyrometallurgical processes. As I mentioned, we really have no picture at all in terms of the numbers or fates of the batteries that are going into these kinds of processes, or around what rates of material recovery is actually happening as a result of them. So we are very much in a vacuum in terms of information here. As we approach these questions of assessing, well, if one were to create a policy regime around these materials, these products, what would that look like? And yes, we're making a prima facie discussion that there probably should be some sort of governmental oversight around what is happening here. And in looking at that, we had two sort of overriding principles. One is to advance sustainability as defined broadly. And there are various definitions out there. Part of this drew from the next generation discussions around sustainability assessment, and a number of other sources as well, the UN SDGs. And then also, it seemed to us some form of extended producer responsibility regime is probably where one would head with this. That makes sense when you're dealing with complex manufactured products like electric vehicle batteries. At the end of the day, recyclability and material recovery is going to be a function of design and manufacturing. So you need to be engaging those who are in charge of design and manufacturing in the process of thinking about what happens at end of life and how do we recover materials. We identified a number of context-specific criteria here in terms of advancing a circular economy more broadly, encouraging second life uses to the extent possible, given the investments of energy and resources into producing these products in the first place. Being very sensitive to the questions of environmental justice throughout life cycle, because not only is this a question at the extractive phase, it's also becoming an issue in terms of where do production facilities end up, and also very definitely at the end of life, because there are certainly suspicions that there may be quite a lot of what might be described as artisanal material recovery happening at the very end of the process in very unsafe and unregulated spaces. We also want to support innovation. In particular, in this space, there is interesting developments around battery chemistry, which are trying to move away from the sort of rare earth and difficult to access, where production may be also both politically difficult and also biophysically problematic, towards other materials, which may be both more recyclable and have less upstream impacts. This leads into notions of design for the environment, which is often portrayed as design for disassembly, although there are some complicated questions in there that we ran into. And then also that a regime needs to provide for transparency, accountability, and oversight. We need to have some handle on what's happening, which I would emphasize at this stage we do not have, and that governments do not have. We did cross paths with there's another research group at the Public Policy Forum who are working on the same topic, and we had a reassuring moment when we both realized we were reaching the same conclusions. That was the happy part. The last happy part, of course, is what that conclusion actually was in terms of where we stand with all of this. We did a series of jurisdictional case studies and scans, which are summarized here. Our standing joke about this, though, is that we didn't do the human participants approvals right on Sumit and Jonathan's major research projects, because we should have had permission to record and reproduce the sound of the crickets on the other ends of the phones when we began asking questions about this. About what do we know? Where do these sit in relation to whatever existing regimes might exist around batteries or around hazardous wastes or hazardous recyclable materials or transportation of dangerous goods? And talking to federal, state, provincial agencies, we got a lot of, we don't know, we're thinking about it, we haven't thought of it. To be more specific, we, in Jonathan's paper especially, we sort of took a deeper dive in a number of jurisdictions. In Ontario, we got ultimately a on the record answer: the intention is to do nothing, from either the ministry or the Resource Productivity and Recovery Agency Authority, which otherwise runs battery recycling activities. Quebec did think about a regulatory regime at one point, and then backed away. In some ways, there was some criticism. They're actually overly restrictive in terms of how they're going to approach things. So where we've been left in Quebec is a voluntary regime, which just came into place in this past June. BC has indicated its intention to extend its extended producer responsibility regime to EV batteries, but hasn't done anything yet. I think they're thinking about how would that work. We didn't find anything from any of the other provinces at this stage. There was a blank at the federal level as well. We have received a letter from Mr. Gibault in response to our report, and we're going to follow up with them on this, which essentially said we're thinking about it. There is some passing reference in the critical mineral strategy, but no substantive policy to date. At the federal level in the US, there was some Inflation Reduction Act funding for recycling activities, but no legislative or regulatory action so far. The two places where there are more interesting stories are California, where there was a bill adopted in the California state legislature, although it essentially set up an advisory process, but that advisory process turns out to be quite important. But again, no actual substantive action to date. And then we also looked at the European Union, and that is a completely different universe. One of the most striking things here is what we're describing here is essentially a blank in North America in terms of any kind of policy or regulatory regime around what happens to end-of-life EV batteries. The European Union has been engaged around this now for 30 years. And specifically, we first see mentions of electric vehicle batteries in the battery directive from 2006, which moves in the direction of an extended producer responsibility regime. As of this past June, the EU adopted a regulation, which is the highest sort of form of European Union legislation. So it is binding on the member states. And I'll talk about the content of that a little bit in a second. So for California, the crucial thing is the advisory committee that was set up through the legislation that was adopted by the California state legislature. And this was a multi-stakeholder process. There's probably a master's thesis, at least, in looking at how this process worked. But it had representatives of the industry, environmental advocates, technical experts, range of different stakeholders around this issue. There was, in general, support for some form of producer take-back regime, essentially, ultimately, where the original equipment manufacturers, the Volkswagens, the Stellantises, the Teslas, the Hondas, the Fords, ultimately have responsibility for what happens to the batteries at end of life. On the other hand, the OEMs in particular, what's interesting in the California report is just particularly what it reveals about the OEMs thinking about this, and so where their heads are at. And there's a very clear rejection of notions of design for disassembly. They weren't very keen on any kind of reporting requirements. I mean, there's an underlying tension here about, do you design the recycling process around the battery as opposed to designing the batteries for recycling, and which sort of turns the normal design for environment notions on their head. And their argument is, well, that design for recycling interferes with innovation and efficiency. They were also not keen on things like standardized state of health reporting, diagnostics, other things that would facilitate repair and reuse. To say, California, substantively, nothing's happened in California yet, as of the point at which we last looked. On the EU side, as I say, we're in a completely different universe almost. The 2023 regulation identifies electric vehicle batteries as a very distinct category of battery, which is new. It's sort of a subcategory of industrial batteries in the earlier directives. This is very, very clearly an extended producer responsibility framework that the OEMs are responsible. There is a prohibition on disposal, and the clear expectation there will be recovery and recycling. There is also requirements for them to provide guidance around safe repair and disassembly. A crucial component of the EU regime is the notion of battery passports, which are designed to provide for chain of custody and information about the battery itself and its manufacturing. This is clearly designed both to provide transparency and accountability about where these things are ending up, but also to provide important information around how they might be recycled or reused. There are carbon footprint reporting requirements in the European Union now as well. An emphasis on ethical sourcing of materials. There are targets around recycling efficiency, and they're beginning to move, although they didn't go as far as they originally said they might, around recycled content in manufacturing of new batteries. There are prohibitions on certain materials as well. And then there are quite extensive registration reporting requirements for manufacturers, importers, and recyclers. So they're very much wanting to get a handle on what is happening here and on the information flows in terms of where things are ending up. So in terms of where did we land, clearly we're in two different universes, depending on which side of the Atlantic Ocean you're on. Some subsequent work has suggested, well, there's things happening in China as well, but that was just beyond the scope of our project at this stage. But this would certainly seem to suggest the need for some kind of national end-of-life regime, which involves some degree of collaboration between the provinces and the federal government. This should be grounded in an EPR framework for OEMs, similar in principle to the EU regulation, so that we need to be capturing these, and we need to have a clear understanding that these cannot go to disposal, and that we also need to have a clear picture on what is happening. The status of these materials do need to be clarified for the purpose of the Basel Convention and hazardous waste and transportation of dangerous goods rules. There's been a distinct, definite ambiguity about that. That's quite deliberate. The same in the European Union, interestingly. I think there's hesitancy to go there, but at the same time, one has to ask questions about, at some point these questions have to be resolved. Clearly, facilitation of second life uses would be very desirable, particularly in DER applications. Again, this is a question that's beyond sort of the regulation of batteries directly as it relates to the design overall of electricity systems, but there are things like battery passport regimes, which could, and state of health reporting requirements, that could be very, very helpful in facilitating the use of EV batteries in second life applications at grid level. As I mentioned, the battery passport thing seems quite central to all of this in the EU framework. And we do need some basic reporting on recovery rates and actual battery fates, around which we at the moment in North America, as I say, is a complete blank. That there's some claims that these things probably aren't going to disposal, but there's no actual evidence in the public realm in terms of what is happening at all. So this does seem a remarkable gap that has implications in different dimensions. There's obviously this downstream question of, well, what happens to tens of millions of batteries which contain hazardous or toxic materials, and how do we ensure their management? But there is also this question of closing the circularity loop in terms of supply chains, that any materials we can recover through recycling or reuse regimes are materials we don't have to extract upstream, with all of the implications that go with that. So that would be both from a security, but also a sustainability perspective, very, very desirable. We did have a look, and this came up at a webinar we were hosting. In fact, one of our colleagues was hosting on Monday. The questions around recovery rates are interesting, or what is possible. And what we've got there is literature is all over the map, ranging from estimates of 20 to 40%. I've seen stuff that goes up to 100%. Rocky Mountain Institute has recently been doing some research which puts the figure somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%. But that helps, but it does also raise larger questions, because given the scale of the extractive activities that the International Energy Agency and others have pointed in the direction of, which is order of magnitude increases in levels of extractive activities, there have to be very serious questions around the sustainability of those kinds of activities, to say nothing of their social and cultural implications. So one of the things we sort of left as a takeaway was that we have to be looking beyond simple replacement of existing internal combustion engine fleets with EV fleets. We're going to have to be looking at the transportation demand management side of this as well, that we can't sustain the numbers of vehicles that may be required to do a simple replacement, especially as vehicle fleets grow. So that again leads us into a larger and more complicated set of questions, but one that has to be coming onto the table, given the questions around the sustainability of the levels of extractive activity that we require to sustain that kind of a throughput transition and straight transition around our electrification of transportation. So I'm going to wrap there. In terms of the opening presentation, as I mentioned, we're recording this. The actual document is available. The report is available on the SEI website for download. And this may be a good place to sort of wrap the initial presentation, probably longer than we intended, but there you go. And we're happy to open the floor to questions. I'll hand over to Laura to handle that. And we welcome your comments or thoughts or questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was an excellent overview of this report, which I personally found really useful for myself, and also for pedagogy and bringing more awareness. So I'll open up the opportunity again to put some questions in the chat or raise your hand. And otherwise, I might start us off with some questions. So one of my questions was just regarding, I guess, the lack of policy within the Canadian context on managing end-of-life batteries. One of the questions I had was for clarification. And so you touched briefly on the Basel Convention in the webinar, although you do talk about it more in depth in the report. So I just wonder, without clarifying the legal status of end-of-life battery management for the purposes of the Basel Convention, does that mean that right now within the Canadian context. And I know that you mentioned as well that Ontario's sort of idea will be just to sort of like let manufacturers deal with the end of life. So is it possible that right now, under current regulations or lack thereof, that this type of waste could be shipped? And then we've got some hands up, so I will save my questions for after. Thank you.
Should I take that one? Probably. I think the short answer is if these are not classified as hazardous wastes or hazardous recyclable materials, the regime under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, import and export of hazardous waste regulations, which basically are Canada's implementation of Basel. And as background, the Basel Convention essentially sets the rules around transboundary movement of hazardous waste and hazardous recyclable materials. The short answer to your question, Laura, is no. There are no requirements that you seek an export permit under the CEPA regulations, and no reporting. So it is in a regulatory vacuum for that, from that perspective. Interesting, the European Union, in fairness, the European Union seems to be in the same place, is they have not classified these as hazardous wastes or hazardous recyclable materials for Basel purposes. So the international trade in these objects, materials, is essentially unregulated. The nearest you get is there are you might be able to get some data on the traffic because there is a customs code for these. So you might be able to get a StatsCan data, but there is no regulatory regime. It means the Basel Convention regime does not apply. So there is no prior informed consent on the part of countries that import, and there is no requirement for authorization on the part of countries that export. It is a Wild West. Is the essential answer.
I can imagine as well. Okay, well, thank you for that. Maybe encouraging answer, I think. Gives us room for growth. But I'm going to pass it on to Steve and then Ethan. So take it away, Steve. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Fletcher, and I'm the Managing Director of the Auto Recyclers of Canada. So we are squarely in the middle of all of these gaps and opportunities. I've seen the report, and unfortunately, like many reports, the time it takes to prepare the research them, prepare them, post them, have people look at them in this field. Oh, so much has happened that is filling in gaps, but certainly not anywhere close to being in a steady state. So our members are businesses that process end-of-life vehicles, and they break them up for parts and materials. And we've been looking at electrification for about 4 years now, just trying to understand the impact upon our business, what resources, information we need, and then working with dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations to just have them better understand sort of who we are, what we are, how we relate to the North American auto recycling economy, the, I'll say, Western economy, and then just the global economy. So one of the things that happens in New Jersey now has EPR regulations for these batteries. So they're the first state that's come out with those. Not enough detail to really understand metrics and who does what, but essentially it is the framework of, okay, OEMs, you built this, you need to take some responsibility in that without indicating how they do that. And that just makes everybody really nervous about what that means, because as an example, our industry competes directly with auto manufacturers in that we sell parts, dealers sell parts. Auto manufacturers don't like auto recyclers selling parts. And that's why you came up with that Quebec attempt, where it was, hey, let's recycle it as fast as humanly possible so there are no reuse opportunities. So we don't disagree with the EPR approach. We just think that people tend to apply an EPR lens for waste on top of the battery, and the batteries are not waste. 2 years ago, it would have cost you $1,000 to get rid of a battery, and so members weren't buying them. Now we have probably 3 or 4 battery recyclers, probably 5 or 6 battery users actively soliciting for batteries, building APIs between our systems and their systems, so that the gaps are getting shorter and shorter in terms of the economics of it all. And I think that's why places like BC have said, yeah, we better not rush to an EPR regulation, because we don't really know how to regulate an asset, which a vehicle and a battery is, versus treating it like paint or packaging, where yes, it requires a lot of money to kind of collect and dispose of. So I think the report, whether it's been influential, I probably have given 5 interviews in the last 2 weeks to the federal government, provincial governments, NGOs, safety people. So it is attracting more and more attention. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time, and they still do, on mining and manufacturing and the actual end recycling. They're now getting a better understanding of on-road use, repair, servicing, and end of life are something that are pretty critical. And unfortunately, many people who've looked at the ecosystem have said, well, we don't really need to worry about that because cars last 10 to 15 years. But our members process total loss vehicles, so they've got 2023s in their inventory. So generally, just comments are, we exist. We've got reports all over the place. I was just on a webinar yesterday with the Europeans on TDG and sort of what's coming on fire planning. So there's a lot of activity happening behind the scenes, and hopefully your report will get more and more Canadians sort of looking at this. Kind of given up on Ontario looking at it, but that's just because where we are. So I just wanted to bring those comments out that we're listening. We're very active in the field, and just trying to make as many connections as possible as we can to our members' inventories and the world out there seeking more batteries.
Thanks so much, Steve. If you're willing to drop maybe any of those resources in the chat, that could be helpful, and we can circulate it after with the recording, maybe some of the chat comments. Okay,
I will do that.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. We're aware this is a very much a moving target. We thought it was interesting. The European Union, they were trying to push the OEMs in part to be providing guidance to the vehicle recyclers as well. So they've got some guidance in terms of what to do, both technically and in the bigger picture. And it was interesting talking to folks in Europe on the recycling side, because in the end they seem to say, the fact that the regime is in some ways stabilizing for us, because it then means we've got a set of rules here, and in fact that helps to stabilize the market for what we're doing, because we know that the service is needed, and that the OEMs are going to have to talk to us about what do we do here.
Yeah, and unfortunately we're behind the ball. Europe has the ELV directive. Europe has the battery directive to sort of try to go from nothing to an all-encompassing system. You can see why there's some pushback. But as an example, there is now an app that our members have, and you just punch in the VIN or year, make, model, and it will pull up the first responder guidebooks for each model, but focused on what does an auto recycler need to do in order to not touch the wrong things, how to decommission. So I would say that 5 years ago, an auto recycler, to understand the state of health of a battery, needed to remove the battery, ship it to Omaha, plug it into $1 million computer, and get the battery shipped back to them. Now there are black boxes that are in the $10,000 range that are being sold to understand that state of health. So that's how fast the technology is evolving on these things, which is a good thing, but we're not anywhere near scale. And that's where the kind of frightening side of things are.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that. I'm going to move to Ethan and then Abdali, and then I'll go to some of the comments and questions in the chat. But thanks so much for that, Steve. Really appreciate that. Ethan.
Hey, so first I want to say thank you for the presentation, and I also want to say I feel sort of uniquely uninformed and unqualified to be here. I saw it posted on the York's Instagram account that you were hosting this, and I was like, I've been interested in these sort of the EV batteries and the sort of discussions about the increasing demand of lithium and whatnot. I'm an undergraduate student at York, and I was just sort of curious, as sort of both environmental scholars and legal scholars. You talked a lot in your report about this sort of issue of transparency and accountability, and the sort of difficulties of finding success in the Ontario sort of context. So sort of like I apologize if this is sort of in the report, but what are sort of the obstacles? Why isn't this something that's being sort of taken up in Ontario? Considering it's been an issue for quite a while now, and it's going to be increasingly so. Maybe from like a political but also legal perspective.
You want me to take that one?
Anyone, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I'm Jonathan is an employee of His Majesty, may not be able to quite go there.
It's okay. I can, as long as
Yeah.
I give my disclosure, I'm happy
okay.
to jump in.
Yeah.
So first of all, as an articling student with the Ministry of the Attorney General, working at the Crown Law Office Civil, I would first like to begin by saying that any views expressed here are of my own and do not represent those of the ministry. So to answer your question regarding the difficulties finding success in Ontario, first of all, it's really important to look at the power of the original equipment manufacturers. These, your Toyotas, your Hondas, your Volkswagens, they have an immense amount of money, an immense amount of lobbying power. And so they're kind of controlling the market right now. What they say goes. And at least that's what I found in my interviews with stakeholders. They have essentially come to Ontario and said, we're handling it. This is not a problem. You don't need a policy. And Ontario has basically said, okay, because there are billions of dollars with these OEMs having manufacturing facilities in the province. They've just built new battery manufacturing facilities in the province, and the province does not want those facilities going anywhere else. They want those jobs, they want that revenue, they want those tax dollars. And so essentially the OEMs have so much lobbying power that if they don't want this policy, there isn't going to be this policy, at least under the current regime. That's the feedback that I got in my interviews and writing the paper. When it comes to, I guess, from an environmental and legal context, I mean, when it comes to a legal context, you have your legislature, and your legislature is going to create legislation. So your provincial parliament is going to create legislation. They're going to pass these acts, and then it comes into law. But if they're not passing legislation, which under the legislation there are then regulations, then there isn't really going to be that legal context. Like if you go currently into the Ontario provincial legislation, you'll see there is a regulation for batteries, like, your vehicle batteries. There's legislation for hazardous waste. There's regulation for tires. And there is just not one for electric vehicle batteries. And until there is some way to either create a win-win with OEMs, or until there is a regime that is willing to push back on those OEMs, I don't really see how a regulation for EV batteries is going to make its way into the legislation.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Abdali, I know you have some comments in the chat too. I don't know if you want to speak to them.
And I should also acknowledge Abdali's contribution to all of this work as well, because he did some of the original legwork as well, and in the early stages of this. I want to thank him.
Oh, well, thank you for that. But yeah, no, so my question is that no, the comments are just for someone who posted about using like batteries as energy storage for solar and wind project, and that's happening in the US, like my company's doing it. But my question is, it's because I'm interested in doing a PhD, and this is some like excellent work. I wanted to know what future research topics would you propose for someone to start on, and also have you all started looking at startups and the work that they do? Because in the U.S., there's kind of a theory or kind of a mantra that startups will solve all problems. So I wanted to know, like, because the data is so diverse in terms of how much of it is being recycled and how much of it is being reused. I just wanted to know whether y'all have looked at startups to see what is the average take on a battery, retake on a battery, whatever.
I think for purposes of our research, I think the short answer is no, not at that level of detail. We know that there are recyclers emerging, although we haven't seen, beyond the stage at which Steve's members who are basically taking the batteries out of the vehicles, but this is sort of the next stage from that. We know some of them are basically doing the black mass grinding, turning them into the black mass. But what happens beyond there at this stage seems a bit of a blank, in terms of, is that being exported? Is there domestic processing happening? We just didn't find anything. So that was a bit of a concern. Jonathan's got his hand up too. And then on the sort of grid application stuff, or non-grid application as energy storage, because you could use this at a household or a facility level as well as backup energy, or even for, if you're a large facility, BGA busting. The regulatory, then there's been studies from the IESO and others in Ontario looking at this question of distributed resources. And the challenge there is that the regulatory regimes just don't exist in terms of how would those resources work in a grid context. The US is way ahead of us on this and thinking about how do you aggregate, hundreds of these things at distributed locations into a grid resource. And we certainly have startups who are thinking about that very seriously and writing the software, but they don't have the actual market for applications, at least in Ontario and in other provinces, is still very, very limited. Sandboxes, as they're called, as opposed to mainstreamed.
I mean, so I just want to add one comment. Okay, so my company and others have started to kind of buy pre-checked, pre-certified used batteries from Tesla and other cars, and then what they do is that then they add it to the capital cost of the project, and then they add it to the PPA rate that they're charging the customer. So if the batteries, because I work as an asset manager, so I can track how much is being produced, and then I help with the billing and the invoicing. So could that be a potential solution for for solar and wind, in Canada, even though the production is not that great compared to other parts of the world? Could that be a solution where a company can charge 7 cents for solar, direct solar energy, but that, let's say, from storage it charges 5 cents, so in the end they're paying and even making more money out of the storage than they are from the solar panel themselves?
Potentially, I mean, I need to get Jocelyn airtime too. The short answer is potentially yes, but electricity markets have not matured to that stage in Canada, is the basic answer. And so far as I can tell, the storage assets that are being acquired are largely on a capacity basis, as opposed to any kind of that sort of a merchant kind of market participation kind of model. But Jonathan wants to get in here, I think.
So I wanted to address two questions. So the first was, you mentioned future research. We do have a section in the paper on future research, and one of the big areas that I thought I could have done more on if I had more time was potentially the Far East. So to see how South Korea and to see how China are developing policy and implementing policy, I think it would be really interesting to see kind of how that aligns or diverts from what the EU is doing. So kind of doing a lot of the work that we did in the paper, but just focusing on the Asian market. Regarding startups, I think with startups, with EVs, I mean, there are a lot of different ways a startup could address it. You could have a recycling startup. I think you could have a second life startup, and then you could have startups that are just looking at improving battery tech. Because one overarching theme for this entire space is that the technology is just moving at rapid speed. I think Steve already mentioned this. Just things are moving so fast and advancing so quickly. And when you look at batteries currently, most of the batteries you have they're what's called liquid state batteries. And a lot of people are now doing research into solid state batteries. There's also research into sodium ion batteries, or batteries that don't necessarily need the lithium or the cobalt or these other minerals that need to be mined. People trying to make batteries out of materials that are more readily available, like aluminum. So I think there is so much out there for startups to do, or for startups, and so much potential for startups to get involved in the space. It's just kind of a question of where their expertise lies and where they want to get into it, because this is really, the technology is really at its infancy, and it's going to change so much. It already has changed so much, the types of batteries that you see in vehicles, the recycling processes. And I think there's potential in all the spaces, especially with touching back on what Mark was saying about the environmental costs of these recycling processes, how from hydro, you just have these huge quantities of acidic solutions that you have to do something with now, or pyro, you have these emissions and energy intensive. Even recycling technologies are things that could be completely revolutionized to the point that they're far more environmentally friendly, far less energy intensive. And so I think for startups, it just kind of depends on where their expertise lies, where they want to get into this market, because I think really at all three phases, whether it's second life, recycling, or new battery technology, there is so much potential to get in there and to create new technology.
Follow up too on the research question. I'm a member of the advisory committee on the Energy Modeling Hub, which is our attempt to bring together all of the energy modelers across Canada. And this year in December was the first time there'd been any conversations about the material side of energy transitions. The modeling has been very focused on the energy and carbon components. And we just have zero modeling in Canada in terms of what the material flows might look like. And for the reason Jonathan just said, part of the challenge is, the subject matter is in motion. The technology may be changing. What we do have, as I mentioned, is, the attempts to start to think of that, about this, are all over the map in terms of what they think the material, what recovery rates may be possible, and what material flows may look like going forward. But so I think that is an area where there are very significant gaps that we've got zero actual modeling for Canada. We've got some stuff that's trying to do this at a global scale, but I say it's all over the map in terms of potential recovery rates, need, everything. So that is the other area where probably additional research is needed. Indeed, I was in the session with an IPCC member on Monday where this came up, and so we just didn't model that. It was part of the answer. So we will, that is, I think, the other huge gap in this conversation, is getting our heads around the potential material flows. And how also they could be different down different pathways, that the extractive based material flows that the IEA has laid out in its initial work, I just find I can't imagine how they could qualify as sustainable when we're talking about increases extraction rates of 30 times for certain types of materials. When earlier conversations about materials and sustainability said, well, we got to reduce materials intensity, newly extracted material intensity of economic activities by factors of 4, factors of 10. It'd be very, very difficult to reconcile that level of primary extractive activity with any notion of sustainability. So that realm is profoundly underexplored and undermodeled.
We have a question in the chat from Mike, but before we get to that, I just on that note, Mark, and thank you, Mark and Jonathan, for your answers for Abdali's question. I think you have provided great insight to somebody wanting to start a PhD program. On the topic of like the difficulty of being able to fit sustainability in the discourse of you know, electric vehicles if we're looking to extract all new materials. Like a lot of the funding, I think, from the federal and provincial government has been toward looking at extractive measures in, for example, Northern Ontario, so that we can kind of like have this energy system very in-house in terms of manufacturing, extraction, battery storage. I've also heard about some of the you know, emissions implications about what would happen if we did mine the peatlands to be able to extract those critical minerals necessary to create batteries. But is that something that you have looked at or that you could speak to, just in terms of if we're looking at the life cycle of doing a transition to electric vehicles? And as you already said, Mark, like it's not a solution to replace all fossil fuels vehicles and automobile systems with EV vehicles. We really do need to look at transportation demand management as a whole. But if that is sort of like the goal and where a lot of investment is going into in the Canadian context, in terms of emissions and sustainability, like what is your take on that? And also this could be an open question to all, but yeah, just in terms of like the transportation, extraction, everything that would be needed to facilitate this type of infrastructure.
Yeah, the short answer is it's problematic and under-examined. We've done, should be in print almost any day. In the new edition of Canadian Environmental Policy and Politics, I did a kind of triage level sustainability assessment of the federal government's clean industrial strategy. And the critical minerals thing, along with the emphasis on nuclear, end up sort of on the red list, as it were, where you have very high adverse trade-off risks in a sustainability context, which at least at that level of the signal, we need to look a lot more carefully. I was the co-PI on a ecological services valuation of the Boreal some years ago. And so one of the really striking findings there was the extent of the carbon sequestration and storage functions of the Boreal, which would be very significantly adversely affected by major industrial development in the region. And of course, that's just one dimension. There are biological diversity questions. There are obviously the questions of reconciliation with the affected Indigenous communities as well, all of which within a sustainability context have to be considered within the decision-making. And at this stage, it's not clear that's happening at all. I mean, clearly the emphasis is to streamline approvals more than ever. And I think also there may be some naivete going on about, I mean, there's always been questions about the economics of the Ring of Fire, especially. And some of these other stuff on the business pages this week about its commodity prices are actually falling. Questions about how big a global player Canada actually is in some of these materials. So there's lots of questions there as well, but also I think some naivete about how commodity markets work, which is you can't capture unless you're in some very strange regime. The producer is going to sell to, if they ever get to the stage of production, these are internationally traded commodities, and they're going to go to whoever the highest bidder is. So trying to lock in a supply chain, unless the OEMs are planning on running mines in Northern Ontario, sort of an old vertically integrated monopoly kind of model, I'm not sure necessarily holds that much water in terms of how these markets work. But I should hand over to Jonathan because I think he wants to get in on this too.
Thanks, Mark, and take it away, Jonathan.
Yeah, certainly a lot to unpack when you talk about the potential development of the North. And I want to give a plug to another faculty member. I know Professor Dana Scott is extremely involved has a lot of knowledge about the potential development of the peatlands. And she's also very close with some of the First Nation communities that would be affected by this. So for potential future talks, I think Professor Scott, this is really one of her areas of expertise. So I think there is this idea that in Ontario, they're building these billion-dollar battery manufacturing plants. And there's this idea of material sourced from Ontario for batteries built in Ontario and kind of creating this huge internal automotive producing economy in the province. And it's very business driven, very economically driven, and it seems like the environmental impacts of the billions of tons of carbon that are going to be released from disturbing these peatlands are certainly kind of being pushed aside. But I do want to highlight another thing that's being somewhat ignored that really interacts with my office a lot are the Aboriginal law issues of there are communities in these areas, there are First Nations in these areas, many of which are very opposed to the development of the Ring of Fire. And this is creating a lot of legal issues when it comes to treaty rights, when it comes to development rights, because you have these communities that some of them maybe don't want development at all, but some of them say, okay, if this development isn't going to happen, we want our piece. We want our fair share of the puzzle because these are traditional ancestral lands. And that I work on several files that specifically have to do with certain claims like this. And there is a lot to unpack here with the stakeholders and balancing the interests, because it's important to realize you have the economic interests of the province of developing this internal automotive production economy. Then you have the environmental impacts, but then you also have the impacts on the First Nations, on the Indigenous peoples in Northern Ontario who have been so impacted already by all of the activities through the colonization of Canada. And now we have this idea of reconciliation and UNDRIP, and the question of, is developing these lands just really going against all of the progress that is intended by reconciliation? So I think it's important when thinking about these potential impacts to see kind of the interests of the different groups and also to see the impacts on all of the stakeholders. And there, it really kind of, you have the life cycle analysis of, okay, we're going to be releasing how many billions of tons of carbon, but then how many billions of tons of carbon are we going to save by producing these vehicles? But then something that can't necessarily be taken into in a life cycle consideration is you're disturbing these ancestral lands of these Indigenous peoples. Yes, you can compensate them financially because really that's all you can do once those lands are destroyed or disturbed. But is that like kind of how do we tackle that when it comes to a life cycle analysis, or can a life cycle analysis really even address those issues?
Thanks so much for that, Jonathan. I really appreciate that answer. I also, like, as you're saying, in terms of things that can't be measured in the life cycle analysis, and like maybe lessons that we've learned from nuclear waste siting, which was also like an after the fact kind of problem that is now happening despite the fact that nuclear has been generating clean energy for so many decades, is it can't be captured where the siting of the waste of these batteries would or could be, I think, too. So we already talked about some of the other ways that Indigenous communities could be disproportionately impacted along the life cycle. And Mark, you had previously spoken about sort of the ways that batteries could be reappropriated, like in not really a safe way. And I think also when it comes to storage, that's something that we should be really considering now from a policy perspective too. I'm going to get to Mike's question before I leave it for too long, but I have another question after that as well, just on that kind of topic. So Mike asked a question that was kind of answered, I think, when you were speaking to Ethan's question, but just in the event we can answer it more thoroughly. A professor at Dalhousie was planning on building a system to use partly or mostly depleted EV batteries as grid storage. a system of racks for each type. Could that be part of the solution?
I think the short answer is yes. I think I know who you might be talking about. Yes, I mean this is exactly the second life application that we've been talking about, is that the battery may be, by the time it's coming out of a vehicle, may still, unless, you know, as Steve was saying, that's obviously the wreck is a different question, but if it's simply because the performance has fallen off, typically you're at about 80% capacity still. And so these are potential energy storage assets, which can be used at a facility or building level. And yeah, there's absolutely nothing that stops you from wiring them together with an appropriate control system to provide the service on whatever scale it is you want, be it a single unit at a household level, to deal with blackouts and things like that, or to act as a storage asset because you got solar PV on your roof, or to have a number of these, you know, together as a distribution level or grid level storage asset. Absolutely. This is what one would want to facilitate, because there is this huge investment of material, energy, we're just talking about labor, capital, in having produced this very complex manufactured product. So you would want, from a sustainability perspective, to maximize its use before you reach the point of ideally dismantling or recycling. To that way you've maximized your return on investment at the upfront stage. So the challenge there is not technological. We have students at Lassonde, at York, who are literally writing the algorithms to make those types of systems work as we speak. The problem has been more models for the way the electricity system works, which in Canada never anticipated those kinds of resources being available, and so doesn't really have a market structure for them to operate, or to I hate to say, but to sort of monetize the value of the service in an electricity system. And that's where the real problem is, because the system's never assumed that you would have assets that could do this kind of thing, and doesn't know what to do with them. The OEB, to its credit, has been trying to think about this. There's some very interesting work from the IESO around this, but it's not been adopted into mainstream policy. And Ontario is probably more advanced than anybody else in Canada in this conversation. The US is miles ahead of us in this space.
Well, thanks for that, Mark, and thanks, Mike, for your question. I don't see any other questions, so I'm gonna ask. Oh, am I missing one?
Jonathan wants to.
Oh, sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah,
Go ahead, and then I'll have one more for you.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand a little bit onto what Mark says, and forgive me if this is information that everybody knows, but I think it's important to realize the difference between when you have wind or solar generated electricity versus electricity that's generated potentially hydro or a nuclear power plant is wind and solar, you don't always have wind, you don't always have solar. So if it's not sunny, if you don't have wind, you don't have electricity. So you need to store these things. Whereas a nuclear power plant, as long as it's firing, you have electricity. A dam, as long as it's flowing, you have electricity. And so that is really kind of what the big challenge is with these energy storage is everybody talks about, to be more sustainable, to get to net zero carbon, we want to get to the point that we're using more clean, sustainable electricity. But the biggest challenge is storing it, because okay, if we get all this like energy when it's sunny, but now in the winter when it's cloudy all the time, what are we going to do? That's really where I think we've gotten to the point that battery storage for wind and solar, it's not necessarily a question of if, it's a must. We have to find a way to store this electricity. Otherwise, it's really just not a viable solution for mass amounts of electricity.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. Excellent. Yeah, excellent comment and point of emphasis. So, okay, so I think that this will be my last question to sort of wrap us up here, and bear with me. But so, Jonathan, I think one of the first questions that we had sort of touched on Ontario's implications in policy development on this issue. And you mentioned that given the power and lobbying of the auto manufacturers themselves, that that could be why Ontario hasn't felt the need for or been in the position to make legislation on this. But given some of the historical and even contemporary examples that we have of putting trust or accountability into industry, and not necessarily just auto manufacturers, but industry in general, to to do anything from remediation to cleanup to responsible sort of environmental mitigation or social harms mitigation. And the track record for that hasn't always been very smooth. If people are looking to sort of this report and this webinar and thinking, I would love for the Canadian context, either federally or provincially in Ontario, and especially given that Ontario is in such a position to be really centering electric vehicles as a part of our economy, what are some of the things that, like, how can we be pushing for something like the battery passport, or something that has like various levels of accountability and transparency in terms of policy in Ontario, even despite the weight given to the power dynamics that are held of manufacturers themselves?
So I think one of the big things, the recommendation in the papers, I think there needs to be some kind of federal system. It was really my biggest takeaway when I looked into the EU. When you look at the EU system, one of the biggest reasons why the directive failed is because the directive essentially left it up to every single individual member state of the EU to set up their own ways for collecting and for processing these batteries. And in the beginning, I think like most of the states hit their target of like 25%, but very few hit their target of 45%. And it was because it was just kind of left up to them to figure it out. And because it was a directive, it wasn't enforced. So I think with Canada and with the US, we're kind of seeing a similar trajectory for that mistake, where it's kind of like this state does this thing, this state does that thing. And then as time goes on, you're going to see kind of what works and what doesn't work. Whereas the EU kind of has already set up this framework. And in my opinion, it's pretty good. It's just a question of if they're going to do it, if they're going to stand by it, if they're going to regulate it. So I think, first of all, there needs to be a federal framework that binds all the provinces. And the second thing is, I think there needs to be some way to create a system where the businesses are incentivized to recover these batteries. It needs to be a win-win. It needs to be a win-win for the environment. It needs to be a win-win for stakeholders and businesses. And I think it kind of goes back to EPR, which is we want to motivate businesses to create these batteries that can be easily broken down so their parts can be renewed. So they're recovering their resources, they're building more batteries, they're making more money, and that it's actually a better business decision for them to recover these batteries and break them down and reuse their materials. I think that's really the challenge, is trying to develop that, because like the businesses are going to do what they need to do to drive revenue. And I think there needs to be some kind of attempt to create a win-win, because otherwise, if it's bad for business, I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar companies that have such a great impact on Ontario's economy. If it's bad for business, they're going to say, too bad. And if Ontario tries to get too tough, I think they're just going to say, no problem, we'll take our business elsewhere. And so that's where I think the federal framework and creating the win-win with the businesses are two of the keys.
Yeah, thanks for that. And also, that's sort of what I was thinking with the battery passport, is that it's like a really actually great opportunity for data collection that could really support a better business model overall. Like it's that the battery passport in itself seems like a win-win on multiple scales.
Yeah, I think it's very central to the reason the EU puts so much emphasis on state of health, battery passports, these sorts of things, is precisely to facilitate innovation in these spaces. And because the folks on the sort of recycle reuse side are sort of saying, especially the sort of higher end, as opposed to just throwing this into a grinder, but actually sort of higher value uses, second uses, are all saying, well, these are the things that we need. in order to be able to function in that space. This is the information we need to be able to build a business case and run and have a viable business model.
So we have the plan. Just need to put it into action. We'll leave that with you, Jonathan. Kidding. Okay, well, thank you so much for engaging with my questions. Thank you to everybody who participated, asked your questions, read the report, and showed up today. And for anybody else who will be accessing the recording, I hope that you enjoyed. Yeah, and thank you so much, Mark, Jonathan, and Sumit.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you
Thanks,
to
Laura, for
everybody
moderating.
participating. Yes, this is good. This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to end the recording now.